The last thing I remembered was the knife. Not the one I was holding, the one I felt slide into my own body at the exact same moment. I remembered the heat, the choking heat that never went away, even in the shade. I remembered her face, twisted with the same hatred I felt, her eyes wild and desperate. I remembered the blood soaking through both our clothes, mingling on the cracked asphalt where we'd fallen together. And I remembered thinking, finally. It's finally over. We died together. My sister and I. In the middle of a ruined street, under a sky that never cooled, surrounded by nothing but dust and bones and the ghosts of everyone we'd lost. Then I opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It was cool. Not cold, nothing was cold anymore, not really, but cool enough to make me realize how hot I'd been for so long. I was lying in my own bed, in my own room, in the house I'd grown up in. The window was open, and a breeze was coming through, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and the distant sound of a lawnmower. A lawnmower. I sat up so fast the room spun. I looked at my hands. They were young. Smooth. No calluses, no scars, no burns from touching metal that had been baking in 150-degree heat. I was wearing a faded sleep shirt that I hadn't seen in years. The walls were covered in posters I'd long since thrown away. I stumbled out of bed and went to the mirror. I was 18 again. I was back. I was back in the world before the heat. The memory hit me like a wave. I'd been 18 when my father died. He'd been driving home from work, and a drunk driver had hit him head-on. Just like that. Gone. One day he was there, and the next he was a phone call, a funeral, an empty chair at the dinner table. My mother, Catherine, had handled it the way she handled everything, by finding someone else to take care of her. A month after the funeral, she'd introduced us to Derek. He was loud, flashy, the kind of man who drove a truck that cost more than our house and wore gold chains that caught the light like warning signals. He was also the kind of man who'd been sleeping with my mother long before my father died. I didn't know that then. I didn't know a lot of things then. The morning after my father's funeral, my mother had sat me and my sister down. I can't take care of you both, she'd said. Not on my own. You have to choose. One of you comes with me. One of you stays here with what your father left. She'd put a check on the table, the life insurance payout, his savings, the little that was left after the mortgage and the funeral expenses. $50,000. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough to change anyone's life. And then she'd said the words that had changed everything. Choose. I'd stood there, frozen. I'd watched my sister's eyes flicker, the calculations running behind them. Lily was younger than me by 2 years. She'd always been the favorite, prettier, more charming, better at saying the right things. She was the one who got the new clothes when I got the hand-me-downs. She was the one who got the attention when I got the leftovers. So when she stepped forward, I wasn't surprised. I'll stay, I'd said. I'll take the money. I remembered the look on her face. The mix of shock and relief and barely concealed contempt. I remembered thinking, I'll take the money, and I'll use it to survive. I'd been wrong. In my first life, I'd taken the money. I'd stayed in the house, alone, watching my mother and Lily drive away with Derek. I'd gone to the bank, deposited the check, and figured that $50,000 was enough to get me through whatever came next. Then came the heat. It started like a heat wave, nothing unusual for the Southwest. A few days of triple digits, a few weeks of it being too hot to go outside. But then it didn't stop. The temperature kept climbing. 100, 110, 120. The news channels called it unprecedented. The government promised aid. The experts said it would pass. It didn't pass. I remembered the day the power grid finally failed. The air conditioning shut off. The fans stopped spinning. The lights went dark. I remembered sitting in my house, watching the water in my bottles shrink day by day, trying to ration it. I remembered what it was like when the money ran out, when the food was gone, when the heat made it impossible to think. I remembered losing weight, losing hope, losing everything. And I remembered, near the end, seeing my sister on the news. Not as a victim, as a survivor. She was wearing a white dress, standing on a stage in front of people who were also dressed in white, holding a microphone and talking about resilience and hope. She was a princess of the new world. She had air conditioning. She had food. She had everything. It turned out that Derek knew people. Important people. Powerful people. And Lily had been his secret weapon. I'd hated her for it. I'd hated her so much that when I finally saw her again, on the street where I'd been begging for water, I'd lost my mind. I'd pulled a knife from my pocket, a small thing, a last resort, and I'd charged at her. She'd had a knife too. We'd died together, our blood mixing in the dust. And now I was back. The door to my room opened. Iris. Are you coming down? I turned around. My sister was standing in the doorway. Looking so young I almost didn't recognize her. She was wearing a sundress, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face still round with the last traces of baby fat. She looked like she'd just woken up from a nap. Coming, I said. She smiled at me, that same smile I remembered, that same perfect, practiced smile. Mom says we have to decide today. She's talking about the thing with Dad's money. Right. The thing. Are you okay? You look weird. I'm fine. Just processing. She didn't ask what I was processing. She just shrugged and walked away. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard her voice calling down to my mother. Everything was happening exactly the way it had happened before. I sat down on the edge of my bed and closed my eyes. Not again. Not the same mistakes. Not the same path. This time, I was going to do something different. This time, I was going to survive. I was already at the kitchen table when they came down. My mother looked tired. She always looked tired now, her face pinched with the strain of being a widow and a new girlfriend and a woman who was about to leave one of her children behind. Morning, Iris, she said. Morning. Did you sleep? Not really. Lily came in behind her, humming something cheerful, and took her seat across from me. She didn't look tired at all. She looked like she'd just won the lottery. Which, in a way, she was about to. We need to talk about your father's money, my mother said, sliding a check across the table. I've been thinking. It's not a lot, 50,000. It won't last forever. But it's enough for one person to start over. I watched Lily's eyes light up behind her carefully neutral expression. I've also been thinking about my new job, my mother continued. I'm not going to make as much as I used to. I can't take care of both of you. So we have to choose, Lily said, the words coming out a little too fast. One of us goes with you, and one of us stays. Yes. I waited. Lily waited. My mother looked between the two of us, a question in her eyes. I'll go, Lily said finally. I want to go with you, Mom. I don't want to be left behind. I can't, she broke off, her voice wavering in a way that was almost convincing. I can't live without you. It was a performance. I knew that now. I'd known it then, too, but I'd let myself believe she meant it. Are you sure, sweetheart? My mother asked. You could stay here. I'm sure. Lily reached across the table and took my hand. I'll take the money. I'll take everything Dad left. And I'll make sure Iris doesn't have to worry about it. She squeezed my hand, and I didn't squeeze back. I just sat there, watching her fake sympathy, watching her pretend she cared. Iris, my mother said. What do you think? I looked at my mother. I looked at my sister. I looked at the check on the table, and the house around me, and the future that was stretching out in front of me. I think, I said slowly, that Lily should go with you. Lily's smile flickered. Are you sure, Iris? I don't want to. I'm sure, I said. Go. Be happy. Enjoy your new life. She'd expected me to fight. She'd expected me to cry. She'd expected me to try to win the argument, to prove that I deserved the money more. But I wasn't the same person I'd been the first time. I was someone who'd watched the world burn and learned that the only person you could count on was yourself. So that's settled, my mother said, relief flooding into her voice. Lily will come with me, and Iris will stay here. How long do we have? I asked. Until the end of the week. Derek is coming to pick us up on Saturday. 3 days. 3 days before she left, and the heat started, and the world fell apart. 3 days to prepare. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Lily fluttered around the house, packing her things, taking photos, pretending to care about the memories she was leaving behind. My mother watched her with a mixture of guilt and relief, happy to have the decision made, happy to have her favorite daughter by her side. I stayed in my room. I made a list. A long list. I wrote down everything I could remember from the first life, the timeline, the temperatures, the day the power went out, the day the water stopped running, the day the food ran out, the day the begging started. I wrote down everything I'd learned. And then I started planning. I had 3 days. 3 days to turn a tiny nest egg into a survival kit. 3 days to prepare for the end of the world. 3 days to make sure I wouldn't die on the street, begging for water. I looked at the list in my hands, and for the first time in 2 lives, I felt something close to hope. This time, I was going to win. They left on Saturday morning. I stood at the window and watched them load their bags into Derek's oversized pickup truck. Lily was wearing a new white sundress, her hair carefully curled, her face bright with excitement. She looked like she was going on vacation, not leaving her sister behind. Derek opened the passenger door for her with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. My mother climbed into the back seat, already rearranging her things, already adjusting to her new life. I didn't go down to say goodbye. I didn't wave from the window. I just watched, silent and still, as the truck pulled out of the driveway and disappeared around the corner. The house felt different without them. Quieter. Emptier. Freer. I went downstairs and stood in the middle of the living room, turning in a slow circle. The furniture was still there. The pictures were still on the walls. But the energy was gone, the constant low-level tension of being the unwanted daughter, the perpetual awareness that I didn't quite belong. I took a deep breath. I had 10 days. 10 days before the heat started. 10 days to turn this house into a fortress. The first thing I did was pull out my phone and start making calls. The money situation was more complicated than I'd remembered. My father's life insurance policy had been small, $50,000. His savings had been another $50,000. Together with the house, which was paid off, thank God, I had about $150,000 in assets. Not nothing. But not enough. Not for what I needed to do. I started with the loans. I applied for every personal loan I could find, online lenders, credit unions, anything that would approve me without a cosigner. I used my father's estate documents, my ID, my social security number. I borrowed $20,000 from one company, $15,000 from another. I maxed out my credit cards. Then I did something I wasn't proud of. I used Lily's information. I'd kept copies of her documents from years ago, when we'd both needed them for school. I still had her social security number, her birth date, everything I needed to impersonate her. I opened accounts in her name. I took out loans in her name. I transferred the money into accounts she didn't know existed. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But I also knew that in 10 days, none of it would matter. The banks would be gone. The debt collectors would be gone. The entire financial system would be gone. What mattered was surviving. By the end of the first day, I'd assembled just over $300,000 in cash and available credit. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Now I just had to spend it. The next morning, I went to Home Depot. I bought 3 reinforced steel doors with deadbolts that could hold back an army. I bought shatterproof security film for every window on the ground floor. I bought heavy-duty locks, extra hinges, and enough hardware to fortify a bunker. The installation cost almost as much as the materials, but I didn't care. I told the installer I'd just inherited the house and I was terrified of burglars. He nodded like he'd heard it 1,000 times before. By the end of the second day, the house was a fortress. While they worked, I was on my phone. I ordered water, cases and cases of bottled water, 5-gallon jugs, collapsible containers. I had them delivered to a storage unit I'd rented a few blocks away, not to the house. I didn't want anyone to know what I was doing. I ordered food, rice, beans, canned vegetables, canned fruit, canned meat. I bought in bulk, the kind of quantities that would make a cashier raise an eyebrow if they saw it all at once. But I used different stores, different delivery addresses, different payment methods. I bought medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, painkillers, antibiotics I ordered from overseas. I bought a water filtration system and extra filters. I bought a solar generator, a big one, the kind that could power a small house for days. I bought guns. That was the hardest part. I'd never touched a weapon before, not even a hunting rifle. But I'd seen what happened in the first life when people got desperate. I'd seen what neighbors did to neighbors when the water ran out. I went to a gun store on the other side of town and bought a handgun, a shotgun, and enough ammunition to make the clerk's eyebrows climb into his hairline. I told him I was a single woman living alone and I was afraid of the heat waves. He didn't need to know the rest. The work on the house took 3 days. When it was done, I stood in the center of my new fortress and listened to the silence. The doors were solid metal. The windows were thick glass, impossible to break from the outside. The locks were industrial grade. No one was getting in unless I let them. I started moving my supplies. I'd rented a storage unit near the house, but I didn't trust it. I needed everything under my control, in my house, where I could see it and protect it. I made trips back and forth, carrying boxes of water and food, stacking them in the basement, the closets, the spare room. I worked at night, when no one was watching. I loaded my old car with supplies and drove the short distance to the house, hauling everything inside by hand. It was exhausting. It was terrifying. But I kept going. By the 5th day, the house was packed to the brim. Water bottles stacked floor to ceiling in the basement. Canned goods filling every closet. Medical supplies in the bathroom cabinets. Ammunition locked in a safe I'd bolted to the floor. I had enough food and water to last me a year. Maybe longer. But I also knew it wasn't enough. In the first life, the heat had lasted for years. I needed to be prepared for the long haul. The 6th day, I went to a plant nursery and bought seeds. Vegetable seeds, fruit seeds, herbs. Everything I could think of that might grow in extreme conditions. I bought soil, pots, grow lights. I bought fertilizer and pesticides and everything else I'd need to keep plants alive without outside help. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if anything would grow in the heat that was coming. But I had to try. I had to believe that I could build something that would outlast the catastrophe. I also bought a radio, a hand crank one, the kind that didn't need batteries. I bought extra batteries anyway. I bought flashlights, candles, lighters, matches. I bought everything I could think of that I might need in a world without power. And I kept watching the clock. The heat started on the 10th day. I saw it coming on the news first, a record high predicted for the region. Temperatures expected to hit 110 degrees. Nothing unusual for the southwest. Nothing that would make anyone panic. But I knew. I knew what was coming next. I called Lily. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice bright and cheerful. Iris. I was just thinking about you. How are you doing? Fine, I said. Listen, Lily. I'm going to tell you something important, and I need you to listen carefully. Oh, this sounds serious. It is serious. A heat wave is coming. Not a normal one. It's going to get worse than anything you've ever seen. You need to prepare. Buy water, buy food, find a place with air conditioning that can run off a generator. Don't wait. Don't think it'll pass. It won't. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Lily laughed. Oh my God, Iris, you sound insane. She was still laughing. Is this your way of getting back at me? Trying to scare me into coming home? I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to save your life. Right. Sure. Because you've always cared about my life. Her voice turned sharp. You know what? I'm done with this conversation. I'm done with you and your weird guilt trips. Goodbye, Iris. She hung up. I stared at the phone for a long moment. I'd actually tried to warn her. I'd tried to save the sister who had left me behind, who had stolen my future, who had watched me die without a second thought. But I couldn't make her listen. I couldn't make her see. I put the phone down and went back to my preparations. The next morning, I woke up to a house that was already too hot. It was only 7 a.m., but the temperature had already hit 90 degrees. I checked the news on my phone. The weather forecast showed 110, with no relief in sight. I turned on the air conditioning. I checked my solar generator. I made sure everything was working. And then I sat down and waited. The heat climbed all day. By noon, it was 105. By 3 p.m., it had hit 115. By 6 p.m., the power flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. I turned on my generator. I closed my curtains. I sat in my air-conditioned room and listened to the silence. Outside, the world was already starting to break. That night, I used the radio to listen for news. The government was issuing emergency warnings. The power grid was failing in multiple states. They were asking people to conserve energy, to check on their neighbors, to stay indoors. They had no idea how bad it was going to get. I turned off the radio and went to sleep. Tomorrow would be worse. But I was ready. The second day was worse. The temperature hit 120 degrees by noon. I watched the news on my battery-powered laptop until the signal died, catching fragments of information between bursts of static. The grid was failing across the southwest. People were being told to stay indoors, to conserve water, to wait for help that wasn't coming. I turned off the laptop and went to the window. I'd covered all the glass with reflective film, but I could still feel the heat radiating through the walls. The solar generator hummed quietly in the corner, powering a single window unit. I'd rationed the air conditioning to one room, sealing off the rest of the house with plastic sheeting and tape. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable. And I knew it was going to get worse. The first text from Lily came on the third day. Iris, something is wrong. The power keeps going out. Derek says it's fine, but it's not fine. I'm scared. I read the message and put my phone down. I didn't respond. 20 minutes later, another one. Please answer me. I know you're probably mad, but I need to talk to you. I picked up the phone and typed a reply. I warned you. Her response was immediate. This is your fault. You jinxed it with your stupid warning. I laughed out loud. She was still blaming me. Even now, when the world was falling apart, she couldn't admit that she'd made the wrong choice. You're welcome to come here, I typed. But there are conditions. What conditions? You leave Derek and Mom behind. You come alone. You help. You don't bring anyone else. The typing bubble appeared and disappeared. Appeared and disappeared. Finally, a single word. Fine. I didn't believe her. I knew she wouldn't come, not alone, not without dragging Derek and my mother along. She couldn't help herself. She was still the same selfish person she'd always been. But I'd given her the offer. The rest was up to her. The next week was a slow-motion disaster. The news channels stopped broadcasting. The internet died. The phone still worked, for now, but the signals were erratic, the calls dropping more often than they connected. I'd prepared for this. I had a backup radio, a satellite phone, and more batteries than I could count. I'd planned for isolation. What I hadn't planned for was the silence. The world outside my fortress was dying. I could see it through the crack in the curtain, the empty streets, the still cars, the bodies that started appearing on the third day. People who'd tried to walk to safety. People who'd underestimated the heat. I'd known this would happen. I'd known it, and I'd done nothing to stop it. There was no guilt. No pity. Just a cold, hard certainty that I'd made the right choice. I'd saved myself. That was all I owed anyone. The first knock came on the 10th day. I was in the kitchen, reorganizing my supplies, when I heard it, a faint tapping against the metal door. I froze, my hand on a can of beans. The tapping came again. Louder this time. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. My sister was standing on the other side. She looked terrible. Her white sundress was filthy, streaked with dust and sweat. Her hair was tangled and matted. Her face was red and swollen, her lips cracked and bleeding. She looked like she'd been walking for days. "Please," she said, her voice so hoarse I barely recognized it. "Please let me in." I unlocked the door and pulled it open. She collapsed through the threshold, her body crumpling onto the floor. She was burning up, I could feel the heat radiating off her from a foot away. I knelt beside her and pressed a hand to her forehead. She was on fire. "Lily, what happened?" "Mom," she said weakly. "Mom and Derek, they left. They took the car and they left me." I'd expected that. I'd known Derek would run the first time things got dangerous. But I hadn't expected her to survive. "What were you doing outside? Why did you leave? You told me to come. You said you'd help me." I could hear the accusation in her voice, the familiar resentment. She'd come here because she'd had nowhere else to go. Not because she trusted me. Not because she was grateful. She was too weak to fight. I carried her to the bathroom and started running cool water over her skin. She shivered when the first drops hit, a sign that she was already in the early stages of heat stroke. I'd spent enough time learning about this to know the signs. "Drink," I said, pressing a bottle of water into her hands. "Slowly. Don't gulp." She obeyed, drinking in small, careful sips. She was too exhausted to argue. "Where are they now?" "Don't know." She shook her head weakly. "They drove off. I ran after them, but I couldn't keep up. I tried to find a car, but nothing worked. I kept walking." "Where did they go?" "Home, I think. I don't know. I don't remember." She looked at me with glassy eyes. "I knew you'd take care of me. You always did." She was wrong. I'd never taken care of her. She'd never let me. But I couldn't let her die. "Stay there," I said. "I'll get you more water. Stay still." She nodded, already half asleep. The next week was a blur. Lily was weak, but she wasn't helpless. She was too sick to cause trouble. And while she was sick, I could focus on what mattered. The heat wave continued. Temperatures spiked to 140 degrees. The air was so hot it was dangerous to breathe. I'd rigged a makeshift ventilation system using the solar generator, but it could only do so much. The house was always too hot, even with the AC running. Lily recovered slowly. She was young and healthy enough to bounce back, but she looked older now, thinner, more cautious, more aware that the world she'd taken for granted was gone. "There's nothing out there," she said one night. I walked for hours, and I didn't see anyone. I think I was the only one left. "No," I said. "There are others. They're just hiding." "How do you know?" "Because I'd seen it. Because I'd lived through this before." "I just do," I said. "You should sleep." She looked at me with that same familiar expression, half jealousy, half suspicion. "You know something, don't you? You knew this was going to happen. That's why you stayed." I didn't answer. "Iris. Tell me." I met her eyes. "I told you. You didn't want to listen. Tell me now." So I did. I told her the whole story, the first life, the heat, the begging, the dying. I told her about my mother and Derek, about the parties they'd made me perform at, about the men who'd touched me and the nights I'd spent alone. She listened, her face pale. "And now we're here," I said. "And you've got nothing. Just like I had nothing. Don't." Her voice was sharp. "Don't you dare compare us. You could have taken the money and done something with it. You just gave up." I didn't answer that. There was no point. Instead, I changed the subject. "Rest," I said. "We'll talk about it later." I went to the other room and closed the door. It didn't take long for her to test the boundaries. The first few days, she was too weak to do anything but lie in bed and drink water. But as soon as she felt better, she started pushing. "I need to go outside," she said one morning. "Absolutely not. There's nothing out there. You told me that yourself. Why are you so scared?" "I'm not scared. I'm realistic. You go outside and you'll be dead in an hour." She laughed. You're so dramatic. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being honest. She didn't listen. She waited until I was in the other room and then she tried to go out the front door. The door was locked. The windows were sealed. She couldn't get out. But she kept trying. You can't keep me prisoner here, she said one night. I'm your sister. You're the person who left me behind. You're not a prisoner. You're a guest. And guests can be uninvited. Her face went white. You wouldn't. I would, I said. Don't push me. The first raid came a month later. I'd been expecting it. I'd seen the packs of desperate people in my first life, roaming the streets, looking for anything they could scavenge. I'd prepared for them. But hearing them outside, pounding on the door, was still terrifying. There's someone in there, a voice shouted. I can hear the generator. Let us in. We'll take what we need and leave. They hammered on the door, trying to break it down. I stayed on the other side, a gun in my hand. Go away, I said. There's nothing for you here. We don't believe you. Then die out there. I don't care. Lily was behind me, trembling. Don't open the door, she whispered. I wasn't going to. They'll kill us. They won't get in. The pounding continued for an hour. Then it stopped. They'd moved on. The weeks that followed were a blur of routine, checking supplies, maintaining the generator, watching the outside world through the crack in the curtain. Lily was quiet. She didn't push me anymore. She was starting to accept her situation. I don't deserve this, she said one night. I don't deserve your help. Probably not, I agreed. But you're my sister. I thought you hated me. I thought you hated me too. I looked at her. But here we are. She didn't have an answer for that. The heat was starting to break. Not completely, it was still lethal, but the temperatures were dropping. The days were still 100 degrees, but the nights were cooler. I could feel the change in the air. We were going to survive. Then the first betrayal happened. Lily had been quiet for weeks. Too quiet. I should have noticed. I should have been more careful. But I'd let my guard down. She waited until I was asleep, then she took the gun from my bedside table. She knew where I kept it, I'd been careless. She stood over me, pointing it at my chest. I want to know where you hid the water, she said. The real water. What are you talking about? The water you're not telling me about. The water you're saving for yourself. I stared up at her. Lily, I've been sharing everything with you. You've been giving me the old stuff. The stuff you don't want. She was breathing hard, her hands shaking. I want the good water. The fresh water. I don't have any more. Liar. I'm not lying. This is all we have. She didn't believe me. She searched the house, the bathroom, the kitchen, the basement. She found nothing. Just the supplies I'd been willing to share. She came back, the gun still in her hand. You're lying. I'm not. Then why are you so scared? Because you're pointing a gun at me. I looked her in the eyes. If you're going to kill me, do it. But if you're not, put the gun down. I'm the only reason you're alive. Her face twisted with anger and shame and rage. And then she lowered the gun. I hate you, she said. I hate you so much. Good, I said. Now go to sleep. You're going to need the energy. The second betrayal came from someone else entirely. A man showed up at my door, begging for help. He was thin and dehydrated, barely able to stand. I should have turned him away. But he reminded me of someone I'd known in the first life, someone who died because I'd been too scared to help. I let him in. He was fine for the first few days. He drank water, ate food, slept in the corner of the basement. I kept him separate from Lily. I didn't trust either of them together. But they found each other anyway. I woke up one morning to find them talking in the kitchen. The man was leaning close to Lily, his voice low and urgent. Lily was nodding, her eyes shifting toward me. I knew what was happening. Don't even think about it, I said. Lily jumped back. We weren't. I know what you're doing. Both of you. You're planning to take what I have and leave me. We weren't, the man said. I don't. Get out. What? Get out. Both of you. Now. Lily refused to move. She stood there, her face flushed with shame and anger, and she said, You can't. I'll tell everyone what you have. I'll tell everyone you're hiding here. I laughed. You think I haven't thought about that? You think I haven't prepared for this? I reached into my pocket and pulled out a detonator. This house is rigged. If I go, this whole place goes. And I'm taking both of you with me. It was a bluff. I'd never had the time, or the explosives, to rig the house. But they didn't know that. Lily's face went white. The man ran for the door. And I was alone again. The days that followed were strange. Lily didn't speak to me. She stayed in her room, barely eating, barely moving. I'd won the battle, but I'd lost the war. I let the silence hang between us. There wasn't anything left to say. It was nearly a year later when the plane flew over. I heard it before I saw it, the distant drone of an engine, the sound I'd been waiting for since the beginning. I ran to the window and looked up. The plane was small, a cargo plane with a faded logo. It wasn't a rescue plane, not really. It was a supply drop, a sign that someone out there was still operating. But it was something. It was hope. I watched it until it disappeared over the horizon. Then I turned to find Lily standing behind me. Is it over? She asked. Is it finally over? Not yet, I said. But it will be. I thought about the two betrayals, the lies, the people I'd lost and the people I'd let go. I thought about the long, brutal months ahead. But I looked at Lily, and I saw my sister again for the first time in a long time. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. The heat didn't break all at once. It faded slowly, like a fever that refused to let go. One week the temperature was still hitting 120 degrees during the day. The next week it was 115. The week after that, 110. Each small drop felt like a victory. I kept track of everything in a notebook, temperatures, supplies, the number of days since the power went out. I wrote down every observation, every change in the weather, every sign that the world might be healing. Lily watched me write. She didn't ask questions. She just sat in the corner of the room, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes on me. Are you going to forgive me? She asked one day. I didn't look up from my notebook. For what? For everything. For leaving. For the gun. For the man. I considered the question. I'd spent so long being angry at her that I'd forgotten what it felt like to not be angry. But I was tired. Tired of carrying the weight of all that resentment. I don't know, I said. Maybe. Eventually. Eventually. Right now, I'm just trying to survive. Forgiveness can wait. She nodded slowly. She didn't push further. The supply drop was the first sign that the world outside was still alive. It happened 2 weeks after I saw the plane fly over. A package landed in the field behind the house, wrapped in a bright orange top. I waited until I was sure it was safe before I went out to retrieve it. The package contained food, MREs, crackers, canned fruit, and a note. We're still here. Help is coming. Stay strong. I read the note 3 times. I'd been preparing for the worst for so long that I'd forgotten what hope felt like. Who sent it? Lily asked. I don't know. Someone out there. Someone who cares. She stared at the package. Is it safe? Probably not. But it's something. The months that followed were hard. The heat was still lethal. The water was still scarce. But the world was slowly starting to recover. I started seeing signs of life outside. Birds, insects, even a small patch of green grass that had sprouted in the shade of a broken wall. I began to believe that we might actually survive. Lily started helping me. At first it was small things, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, organizing supplies. Then she started taking on more responsibility. She learned how to operate the solar generator. She learned how to purify water. She learned how to defend herself. You don't have to do this, I told her one day. I know, she said. But I want to. Why? She looked at me for a long moment. Because I'm tired of being useless. The first real test of our new dynamic came 3 months later. A group of survivors had found our house. They'd seen the solar panels, the signs of habitation. They were desperate, hungry, willing to do anything to get inside. We don't want to hurt you, their leader called out. We just want to trade. We have medicine. We have information. I looked at Lily. She looked at me. Do we trust them? She asked. No, I said. But we can't stay locked up forever. I opened the door. The leader was a woman, tall, thin, with a face that had seen too many hard winters. She held up her hands in a gesture of peace. Please, she said. We need water. Just a little. We'll give you anything we have. I studied her face. She looked honest. But I'd learned not to trust appearances. Trade, I said. 1 gallon of water for every pound of medicine you have. We'll weigh it together. Deal. The trade went smoothly. The group left after an hour, grateful and relieved. I'd given them more water than I'd planned, but it felt right. Was that safe? Lily asked as we watched them disappear into the distance. No, I said. But it was necessary. What happens next? I don't know. I guess we wait and see. The days got warmer again. Not unbearably so. The weather seemed to be stabilizing, settling into a new kind of normal. The nights were still cold, but the days were bearable. I started experimenting with seeds. I planted a small garden in the backyard, using soil I'd hauled from the store and water I'd filtered from the last rain. To my surprise, the seeds actually sprouted. Look, Lily said, pointing at the tiny green shoots. They're growing. Of course they are, I said, but I was smiling. That's what plants do. The winter was harsh. For the first time, we had to deal with cold temperatures. The generator couldn't keep us warm, so we burned anything we could find: wood, paper, old furniture. We huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat like we'd shared everything else. I never thought I'd miss the heat, Lily said. Neither did I. Do you think it's over? The heat wave? No. But I think it's getting better. Slowly. She nodded. Do you think Dad can see us? I thought about our father, the one who'd died before any of this began. He'd been the only one who'd ever made me feel safe. He'd been the only one who'd ever made me feel like I mattered. I hope so, I said. I hope he's proud of us. He is, Lily said. He has to be. Spring arrived. The snow melted. The air grew warmer. The garden came back to life, stronger than before. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we'd made it. The other survivors, the ones we'd traded with, came back. This time, they brought news. The government is coming, the leader said. There's a camp about 100 miles north. They're taking people in. Anyone who wants to go. I looked at Lily. What do you think? I asked. She didn't hesitate. I think we should go. Why? Because there's nothing left for us here. We've done everything we could. We survived. But surviving isn't the same as living. I felt something shift in my chest, a weight I'd been carrying for years. She was right. We'd survived the end of the world. Now it was time to start living. Okay, I said. We'll go. We packed what we could carry. Food. Water. Supplies. The notebook I'd been writing in, the one that chronicled our journey from the beginning. I kept it close to my chest, a reminder of everything we'd been through. We left the house behind. The fortress. The bunker. The place we'd called home. I didn't look back. The camp was a tent city, sprawling and chaotic. But it was alive. It was full of people who'd survived, who were trying to rebuild, who were still fighting. I stood at the edge of the camp, watching the activity, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. What now? Lily asked. I looked at her. She was taller than I remembered. Stronger. Different. Now we learn to live again, I said. The camp was run by a woman named Dr. Evans. She was a former government scientist, one of the few who'd seen the heat wave coming and tried to prepare. She'd lost her family in the chaos, but she hadn't lost her purpose. Girls, she said, welcoming us. We could use you. We have food and supplies, but we need people who can work. I can work, I said. I can too, Lily added. Dr. Evans smiled. Good. Because we're not done yet. The heat wave's over, but the recovery is just beginning. I started helping in the medical tent. I wasn't a doctor, but I'd learned a lot during the long months of isolation. I'd read every book on medicine I could find. I'd practiced on myself, on Lily, on anyone who would let me. Lily helped too. She organized supplies, cleaned wounds, held hands when they needed to be held. I never thought I'd be doing this, she said one day. Helping people. Neither did I. But I like it. It feels good. It does. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm sorry, Iris. For everything. I know. I mean it. I'm really sorry. I looked at her. Really looked at her. She wasn't the same person who'd left me behind, who'd chosen money over family, who'd tried to steal my future. She was different. She'd grown. She'd changed. I know, I said. I forgive you. The years that followed were hard. There were setbacks, failures, moments when I thought we'd never make it. But we kept going. We kept fighting. We kept hoping. And slowly, the world began to heal. The heat waves ended. The rains returned. The desert bloomed, green and alive for the first time in years. We helped rebuild the cities. We helped replant the forests. We helped create something new out of the ashes of the old. I never forgot the past. I never forgot the people I'd lost, the things I'd seen, the choices I'd made. But I didn't let the past define me anymore. I was more than the sum of my mistakes. I was more than the sum of my survival. I was alive. I was free. I was finally, truly, whole. The last entry in my notebook was simple. We made it. The heat is gone. The world is healing. And so am I. I closed the notebook and set it aside. The sun was setting outside my window, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen.